at the Sisters Oregon-based Roundhouse Foundation. In our previous episode, you met John Cornelius. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I suggest you check it out. John is a powerful and inspiring human who brings hope to the communities where he works. His lived experience as a Native veteran who struggled with addiction and survived 2 suicide attempts has shaped the work he does around firearm suicide prevention. It was a privilege to interview him. Today I want to zoom out a bit and talk about the important role of partnerships when it comes to tackling the complicated, uncomfortable, and sometimes taboo issue of firearms. Jessi LaRose is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Missouri Foundation for Health. The foundation serves 84 counties in Missouri, including the city of St. Louis. Jessi has been with MFH for 13 years, and before that, she was a grantee of theirs. Jessi runs Missouri Foundation for Health's Firearm Injury and Death Prevention program. So I started out by asking her about it.
Yeah, it's been a pretty interesting progression into our work on firearm injury and death prevention. We actually started in this work around 2016 and started kind of in response to the death of Michael Brown. There was a lot of work happening in Ferguson, and the foundation was responsive to several efforts that were starting to take root, including some food justice work, some community violence work. And so we're really trying to figure out kind of how the foundation could support and engage in those efforts happening locally. What we quickly discovered when we got involved with some of the community violence work here in St. Louis, as the major urban area that the foundation serves, that one, our foundation has a much larger reach and span than just St. Louis, and started to look at all of the data around firearm injury and death prevention, recognizing that yes, historically, traditionally, people think about community violence in St. Louis, but if you look across the numbers, firearm suicide actually accounts for about 60% of death and injury by firearm in Missouri. So quickly kind of had to kind of pivot and think about our initiative at a larger level and being inclusive of what's happening and what's impacting all Missouri communities that we serve. And so really being inclusive of that community violence and firearm suicide prevention. And so early on, we also did a lot of kind of thinking about like, how do we even talk about the issue in Missouri, and did some work with a group called Frameworks Institute to do some research in Missouri. Did a variety of different kind of methods of talking to Missourians and doing focus groups and some kind of narrative testing, and really found that if we initially started talking about this as firearm violence prevention, with our intention of this including all kinds of firearm injury and death, accidental, suicide, and community violence, but really found that didn't resonate with the general public. When you said firearm violence, they thought immediately of community violence in St. Louis and weren't thinking of those other types of injury and death. So we expanded to kind of how we talk about it. We talk about it as firearm injury and death prevention to try to be a little bit more inclusive of firearm suicide or domestic violence that involves firearms and accidental. So really being that kind of having that spectrum of different things included under that umbrella. And so kind of concurrently, as we're working around some of the work in St. Louis, we also, we expanded across the state to be a much more inclusive initiative. And a couple years into our work, we launched a separate firearm suicide prevention initiative, all under the umbrella of firearm injury and death prevention, but really focusing on firearm suicide. And really key to kind of underlying all of this work is a focus on community-driven efforts. So we made an early decision as we entered into this work that it was all new. Not a lot of people in Missouri were doing. Community violence was limited to St. Louis, some work in Kansas City, not anywhere else in the state. Firearm suicide prevention was very limited. Suicide prevention stakeholders in the state weren't really talking explicitly about lethal means. We're not talking explicitly about firearms. And so recognizing that the field was kind of emerging or was not kind of in that place that was really highlighting that component. And made the early decision that we weren't directly focusing on advocacy or state level policy work because that didn't seem like the right approach or that was going to be the most effective in the state of Missouri. So we really have focused tightly on community driven, community led, community informed efforts around both our community violence portfolio and our firearm suicide prevention efforts.
You and I got connected because both our organization and yours are connected through a funder collaborative called Fund for a Safer Future, who's also working on gun violence prevention and firearm suicide prevention. So it's been really great to get to know you through that effort. We hosted that group here in Sisters in 2023, and you hosted the group in St. Louis just earlier in here in 2025. And we got to hear from some of those partners of the work that you're doing and how you led that work, you as Missouri Foundation for Health and your partners collectively. And one in particular, we had a really great conversation on the podcast with John Cornelius, who was formerly with FCC Behavioral Health, and really appreciated his take as a stakeholder on the ground, learning from him. I know that you'd worked with him in the past and FCC Behavioral Health. I'd love to hear a little bit about that relationship. And then I want to step back and hear more about the larger scale work that you're doing with those partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John is great. And we've been working with FCC, I think, as a foundation, probably in various ways through our history. In particular, I think since inception, have worked on behavioral health, mental health in some form or fashion since since day one, and that's really evolved in different ways. So there's a lot of partners that we've had with the firearm suicide and community violence that have worked on different capacities over the years, because a lot of our partners in this space most of them are not sole focus on those issues. They work in a lot of different ways in community. And so, yeah, we've worked with FCC. There are also, that particular work is partnering with Safer Homes Collaborative in St. Louis under the Missouri Institute for Mental Health. And so have really been, working with those two organizations, and that FCC in particular, bringing that really rural perspective in Southeast Missouri. For those who don't know, Southeast Missouri, we affectionately call it the Boot Hill because it looks like a boot. If you look at a map of Missouri, not everyone is familiar with that, but very rural area, high rates of firearm injury and death, both on community violence and firearm suicide, high rates of poverty, economic distress. And so a lot of just high need, but a lot of great community assets there as well. And a lot of great organizations doing hard work and important work in that space.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting component of this larger project that you all pulled together, that all presented when we were in St. Louis. But I think the way that you structured that program, I'd love to dig in on the funders' perspective, because it started with, of course, there's community-driven effort, but this planning grant and identifying partners in a variety of different regions that you serve. So talk about how you structured that program.
Yeah. And I can talk about both our firearm violence, community violence work, and our firearm suicide prevention work, because they were structured slightly differently, but kind of led us to the same way to engage with partners. With our firearm suicide prevention efforts, as I mentioned earlier, like in Missouri, there are groups working in suicide prevention. There wasn't a lot working explicitly in firearm suicide prevention. So recognizing that we needed to help build the field, give people space to kind of figure out what they needed to do, how they wanted to work. And so the way we structured that particular opportunity is we provided 2-year planning grants. And our cohort, we have 7 grantees spanning 8 organizations. And these organizations represent, some of them are behavioral health organizations. Some of them are more community-driven community service, social service organizations as well. And none of them, as I mentioned, had a lot of experience directly in firearm suicide, while some might have been working in suicide prevention in some ways, but were interested and had a passion to be engaged. And so really spent the better part of 2 years just kind of figuring out what needs to happen in community, listening to community, figuring out what populations they really wanted to engage and target, building relationships and trust, and just learning how to like talk about the issue and engage in conversation. I think coming into this, most of our grantees in our firearm suicide prevention cohort are in rural areas or at least outside of St. Louis. So some of that, the rurality kind of varies when some very, very rural areas to those that are not St. Louis, but they are still large, decent sized populations. And a lot of them, firearms is an important part of their local context and local culture and local community. And so really just trying to figure out, how do we even talk about this issue? And I think what they found is they couldn't start with firearm suicide prevention. They had to take it kind of step by step, like, what is their relationship with the community, and where does the community like currently trust them? If they're a mental health provider, it's starting to talk about mental health, which is hard in itself, but starting to talk about that and mental health in a variety of ways, not just mental illness, but mental well-being and the whole spectrum. And that would lead them sometimes to talk about suicide prevention. And once they talked about suicide prevention and built some trust and engagement there, then they could talk about lethal means and firearms. So it really was kind of figuring out, where do they enter into the conversation from a place of trust in their local community, and how do they talk about firearm suicide prevention in that context. And we have our rural grantees are serving a variety of different communities, and that really kind of spent the first 2 years planning, just figuring out, who are the partners in here, who are credible messengers, who do we need to engage with. Gun owners are around the table for all of our grantees. Many of our grantees staff are gun owners or gun enthusiasts. So that's been an important identity to have included. Some of our rural areas are working with the farming community, agriculture, youth, working through 4-H and kind of those youth organizations. So working with a variety of different, communities in their geographic reach. Mm-hmm. And so after those 2-year planning grants, our grantees we have provided 5-year implementation grants. So kind of building off what they learned, kind of refining their approach. They are in the midst of kind of about halfway through their 5-year implementation grants. And important to this is baking in a lot of like flexibility and time for kind of learning and iteration and adaptability, because the field of firearm suicide prevention, while there's some trainings out there's some things happening in clinical settings, there's not a lot of evidence base in terms of what works in these kinds of community driven efforts and that local context. And we've really found like that local context is important in allowing people to really, start from a place of trust, to build relationships, be responsive to their own local communities and those needs. And so that's been a very important part. And a part of this work, too, is bringing all of our grantees together on a regular basis. So we do in-person convenings several times a year. We do monthly virtual lunch and learns on various topics. But really, they have built this kind of support system around the topic and around each other. I think it's been really powerful in terms of like, during the planning phase of like, this worked in our community, and them being kind of those advocates saying what works in their local context, rather than us as the funder saying, oh, you should be able to do this, like hearing from each other, being that support system of like, this worked and this didn't work, and has really been helpful. And really have seen this kind of them build community over the past several years. And they're referring other partners to each other, and like really have built almost a family-like atmosphere. So that's been an important part of that work, is that learning community.
You're one of the few organizations that I've heard of that pays for planning time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Talk about how you all came to that decision, why that's important. Mm-hmm. What do those grants look like? Are they like $5,000? Are they, how do you implement something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think So with our firearm suicide ones that were 2 years, we didn't have a set amount that they applied for, but I think they were kind of generally in probably the $300,000 range. And one piece of feedback we got from those grantees in the planning stage, though, is we tried to leave it flexible, but they're like, what do we do in planning? Like, and maybe kind of pointed to like, there's some frameworks that like different funders use to like help you go through a planning process. And so we left it very open while we provided support through our other contractor, Open Fields, who has brought the learning cohort together and has provided technical assistance. They liked having the planning time, but they're like, we could have maybe used a little more structure in the planning of like, but we felt that was really important because particularly with firearm suicide, there wasn't set interventions that they could just, plug and play. They needed to kind of build relationships and confidence in talking about firearm suicide. For really felt that was important for them to have that time to do before jumping into kind of a full blown project, and also understanding who they wanted to kind of engage with in community. On our firearm violence side of things, these grants, the pre-planning grants, are much smaller, around 75,000 for 1 year, and really, just intended to kind of have those community conversations and engage and kind of just understand the issue. And our planning grants are 2 to 3 years, kind of leaving those flexible to meet the needs of the organization and the pace that they can and want to go at, and are typically more in the 400,000 range.
Yeah. And it seems like it's been a huge benefit to actually then implementing the work on the ground, because there is a plan and they've built those relationships, and they're really able to then just push forward with the really heavy, hard work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say with our firearm suicide, those were all kind of limited to that 2 year time period. But we've noticed, I think, with their community violence ones, that we've been a little more flexible. While the pre-planning was intended to be a year, they might have needed a little bit more time to kind of figure out everything, or the planning grants, they might need a little more time. So really, I think building in that flexibility too, then recognizing we put out a year as pre-planning, but that might not be enough. So being flexible of doing, no cost extensions, and being flexible within, they may have submitted a budget to us a year ago, but like needs change. And so allowing that kind of flexibility as they dive in, learn more about their community and what the needs are.
Well, and I love that you allowed that pre-planning opportunity, and that if people went, hey, this isn't for us,
Mm-hmm.
that they could step away because that maybe their community isn't ready or their organization isn't ready. I think that's such an opportunity for folks to go, hey, let's try it. And if it doesn't work, that's okay too.
Yes, that was important for us to, and that's also, I think, why we sort of designed this as multi-step processes, because understanding that you don't want to get tied into a multi-year implementation project when you weren't ready for it, or your community decided that was not the best way to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we recently had a conversation with John Cornelius, who through FCC Behavioral Health was a recipient of one of your planning grants and larger grants as it relates to firearm suicide. Talk about how you connected not only with FCC Behavioral Health, but with John, and how he has a tremendous amount of lived experience. Why is that critical to the work that happens on the ground?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to provide a little bit of context on FCC, they're actually a partner with another grantee, the Safer Homes Collaborative. So we'd actually developed our first relationship with Safer Homes Collaborative based in St. Louis, and had been working with them at the beginning of our work. They were the first kind of organization we started even working on firearm suicide before we had an initiative, and they had built relationships with FCC. So that's how our relationship directly with firearm suicide kind of came through Safer Homes Collaborative, wanting to partner, looking at the suicide prevention, our suicide rates in the Southeast, and building that partnership and relationship with FCC. So those organizations together kind of were our grantee. And I think early on, they thought that their main focus, or primary focus, and I think it still partially is around kind of construction, those populations that had high rates of suicide. And so they initially really started working, I think, outreaching to local employers in the Southeast who had kind of construction related professions. But as they built the team in FCC and they started to kind of hire different staff members, I think they began to really think about what lived experience is on the team, what relationships are naturally there, how do we kind of mobilize our staff's expertise and interest, and making and building relationships in different ways in the community. And so I think, again, this is kind of where the planning time really was helpful too, in allowing our grantees to just kind of like, where we have inroads in different relationships. And so people like John, who have experience in the faith community, and that is a large part of their lived experience and their identity, as well as John is also a veteran as well. And so I think providing that flexibility for staff and our grantee teams to kind of figure out what's the best way to use their time, capacity, and resources in building partnerships and relationships. Other members of the FCC team, I think, worked more with the construction industry, but John really had that faith-based relationship and saw a need and an opportunity to expand on kind of where he knew people, he understood those partners and saw a need. Yeah. And so I think he really also was able to navigate and integrate teachings and things like that really resonated with the faith community and came in a very genuine way. And so I think that was really allowed him to build upon his skills, his expertise, his experience in relationships.
Yeah. And again, the opportunity to be of community and be a part, have your experience sort of lean into how to make impact and make change in the community that you serve.
And I think John, I don't know if he told you this story when you talked to him, but his car is wrapped with 988. And one of the last times I saw him in person, he was getting an oil change at the local Ford dealer, and the mechanic came out, wanted to know more about his vehicle. And he just had a conversation right there about suicide prevention. Turns out one of the other mechanics had just lost a family member to suicide. Mm-hmm. And next thing you know, John is scheduled to do suicide prevention education with the service department at the Ford dealership. So I think John and many of our grantees are advocates true and are always looking for opportunities to connect and talk about what they're passionate about. Many of them are suicide survivors or have different relationships with suicide survivors and are just so passionate about this and are ready to talk and engage. They're frequently never off. They're in community and outside of work hours, still being that advocate for the work.
Yes. I love the Hope Mobile. We talk a lot about the Hope Mobile. It's pretty great. Mm-hmm. One partner that we heard from when we were in St. Louis was working on direct relationship with firearms with veterans and law enforcement officers, and the stress that those folks are under, and then the connected access to lethal means, and just really appreciated the highlight of that group of folks that I don't think we talk about enough. I know we do talk about veteran suicide very frequently, and the unfortunate statistic that we see as it's tied to that particular group of folks. But I think we forget to talk about law enforcement and first responders and the stress that they manage, seeing whether it's first on scene for a suicide or a community violence act, and then having to manage that stress, or just the effects of the job on a regular basis. So have appreciated that that's also been part of your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's been thinking about first responders from a variety of ways. What role did they play in the intervention and solutions, as well as being the recipient of those services and needing that assistance as well. And I think what we've also really learned more about too is from the agricultural community, the stress that farmers experience for a variety of reasons, and how that's driving some of the suicide deaths and the need in those communities. One of our grantees, one I mentioned earlier, that works in Northeast Missouri, I think lost in a very small community, lost several men over the course of several years to firearm suicide. And it's just greatly impacted their community that's very small as it is, and just really are feeling those impacts.
Yeah. I mean, and it's one of those, no matter the size of the community, that core group of folks that are around those
Mhm.
folks, it's just such an impact. And so being able to have the support and the cultural understanding of where communities are coming from, it's really critical. And this is me being naive, I'm sure, but the more that we're in this space, it feels like there is enough movement that this is an issue that America can come together on. And I know it feels very Pollyanna, but I'm like, this is it. There is this space where if we have just the kind of cultural conversations around how firearms are a cultural construct in places and what they mean to people, but really talk about the suicide prevention and the violence prevention work in a way that resonates, because it's coming from, nobody wants their child or their parent to die by suicide. And we know that firearms are so lethal in comparison to other means. It's such a critical conversation, and gives me a lot of hope in this space.
Mm-hmm.
What's giving you hope in this work?
Every day I am so amazed and impressed by the work that our partners do on the day to day. It's been such an honor to be able to work with this group of grantees across both of our initiatives, but also the relationships we've built outside of our grantees in the fields, both in Missouri and across the nation, with groups like Fund for a Safer Future. But it gives me hope, like the work people do on the day-to-day basis and the success that they've heard. It's also really important to like celebrate the small wins. It's funny to me, and when I have a grantee, they're like, "Oh, this thing happened. We didn't think it was a big deal," and I'm like, "No, that was huge. You've been trying to get a partner to come to these meetings for 5 months, and then they showed up and they brought all these resources. Like that's huge. Celebrate these wins. Like this is long, hard, difficult work, and it's going to take years to see decreases in firearm suicide deaths or community violence, but there are all of these meaningful impacts along the way, and the hard work that people have been doing and have become just the go-to people in their community and are championing this work and making connections. That's what gives me hope, and getting the honor to work with these organizations and these individuals over the past number of years has just really brought me a lot of joy and hope in this work.
And being connected to folks on the ground it's always such a treat, because I do feel like as philanthropists, like we get to work with really incredible people who are doing really incredible work, and it is an extension of our work, but it's not our work. And that's just such a treat to be close and get to know folks. So, and it's been great to get to know you through our work with Fund for a Safer Future. And I really just have appreciated everything y'all are doing and the leadership role you've taken in Missouri, and bringing that voice to the national stage. So really appreciate everything that you've done.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I would just mention too is something that I think we've been trying to elevate to the funding community is, one, this is addressing firearm violence, firearm injury and death is important for health philanthropy, but philanthropy across the board. This is a health issue. It impacts the communities that we serve, and also getting the funding community who is frequently kind of skewed towards community violence is thinking about this in more broad, and thinking about it within the firearm suicide prevention context, thinking about how this impacts not just our urban areas but our rural areas too. And so I've really been just trying to elevate that message that we need to be thinking about this across the spectrum in the different contexts. And also just elevating like local context matters and working deeply in community and resourcing those communities to be responsive and be responsive to the needs of their communities and what works at the local level is really important.
Yeah. You're exactly right. That the local context matters. It's different, as you've mentioned, working in Northeast Missouri farming communities than it is in the Boot Heel and Southeast Missouri working with faith-based organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And how that shows up in community is similar, but not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And big sweeping grants to big organizations, while they can have an impact, that top-down approach doesn't always find the communities doing the right work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you come to Missouri, you'll probably hear at least once that we're the show me state. And so frequently if people want to know how it's going to work in Missouri and what's the Missouri context. And, maybe we're not so different sometimes, but it is important to those working here of really like what's in it for my community. How is this responsive to those who live here?
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing what you're working on. I just appreciate it. There's so many valuable lessons to other funders and other opportunities to dig into this work. We just appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
I can't say enough about joining funder collaboratives or pooled funds as an opportunity to get to learn together, where philanthropic institutions and foundations can come together and go, I am interested in this topic, but I don't know where to start, or I don't know how to do this work collectively. Let's talk about it. The Fund for a Safer Future has been that place for Roundhouse, and I got a chance to meet great people like Jessi and learn from Missouri Foundation for Health. Their planning grants that they implemented for this program is something I haven't seen before, and frankly, something that Roundhouse doesn't do at this point. I'm really interested in seeing how we can build off of those programs that Jessi and her team have put together. Being able to see and hear from folks that Missouri Foundation for Health had funded, to get a chance to meet those folks face to face and hear all about the impact that their programs are having on the ground, that local context. It gave me the chance to meet with John and learn from him. It's such a wonderful part of this ability to be in the role of philanthropy, to be a funder. We can see things and connect people that maybe haven't been connected before. Let's celebrate that work and amplify it. Find ways that we can share best practices, share opportunities and things that have worked in other places, and maybe they'll work for the communities that we work with. You can find more information on Missouri Foundation for Health's Firearm Injury and Death Prevention Program, as well as Fund for a Safer Future, at fundingrural.com.